in answer, somebody asked me a question earlier today, and I answered it by explaining that I'm a voracious reader. I mean, the idea that I'm sitting up here without something to read is kind of against my nature. And somehow or other, and I can't explain it, I've developed the ability to read and, quote, seek out anomalies. If you read as much as I do, things start to follow patterns. And then something peculiar happens, and something gets entered into the equation that doesn't fit. I mean, I gave the example about the fact that I've been reading all this stuff, and I had numerous repetitious references to Williston, South Dakota. And I looked it up, and Williston was 20,000 people. And I just couldn't figure out why it kept coming up in my reading. And obviously the Bakken Shale and all that stuff, but still, I basically got on a plane and went to see it. And from that, emanated a lot of other things. But that's just kind of typical. You know, I went to India in 2003 because outsourcing kept coming up in my reading, and I didn't understand it, so I had to go see it. I think philosophically, I've always been someone who has to go see it. I think that, part of the definition of an entrepreneur is an extraordinary observer. I've never met an entrepreneur who wasn't a very good observer, because it's those observations that all come together and lead to conclusions. And so I try my best to be as knowledgeable as possible, and yet try and do the best I can to not clog my capabilities with information that useless isn't the right word, but maybe conventional. I read a book and a half of escapist fiction a week. I read 5 newspapers, probably 10 magazines a week. I read all kinds of writings by various savants, all of which contributes to have the ability to have an opinion.
How you get ahead in the business world being optimistic?
Well, first of all, I think optimism is a condition. I think I think being optimistic is just a wonderful gift that unfortunately not everybody has. And if you are optimistic and you can see the silver lining rather than the black cloud, I think it gives you self-confidence and makes you a more effective player. On the other hand, as an investor, I'm keenly aware of the risks of, too much optimism. Every time we have a cycle in real estate, we see the guys laying by the road who were too optimistic. I tend to think that they weren't so much too optimistic as they didn't quantify the downside. I think that from my perspective, I start every potential investment focused on what's the downside. And frankly, from my opinion, from my perspective, if we do a deal and we identify the downside and we're correct, then I view that as a successful endeavor, even if the transaction didn't work. That the real estate business, more than anything else, is looking for growth in the economy. When it's all said and done, if we all go outside right now, we won't find any desks in the street or people sleeping in the street. So somehow or other, the supply-demand scenario for real estate in Denver today is relatively in balance. There's a basic conflict between growth and, in effect, quote, spreading out and redistribution of wealth, which has been a theme of the current administration. The reality, from my perspective, is if you're redistributing wealth, you can't create growth. This country was built on aspiration. The aspiration of all of our people. The aspiration of all of those immigrants who came and were given another shot, another experience. If we lose that aspiration, if we lose that motivation, then we're going to end up like Western Europe. And I don't think that's a particularly attractive resolution. I don't know how many transactions I've done in my lifetime, but I've certainly had both, my share of successes and my share of failures. In 1993, I bought control of a department store company in California called Carter Hawley Hale. Before we closed the deal, I had my people do a complete analysis of the company, and they came back and said the company, as a fire sale liquidation, is worth $50 million less than you're paying. As far as I was concerned, that was great news because I could now quantify my risk. 3 years later, and lots of terrible things happening, we almost went under, and we sold the business at the last minute to Federated Department Stores for $50 million less than we paid for it. So the answer is we quantified the risk, we understood the risk, and we went forward. Even though I lost $50 million on that transaction, I consider that transaction a very big success. And it was a success for the following reasons. Number one, I took a risk, and I understood the risk, and I quantified it correctly. Number two, yes, it didn't work, but unless you're willing to take risk, you can't have any winners. So from my perspective, understanding where I'm at and what my optionality is, and if that understanding is correct, that works. So I think the integrity of what you do, the focus of what you do, the degree to which you understand the risk you're taking is what it's all about. I've always been interested in business and interested in how things fit together, and I was perpetually kind of starting businesses, and I had a friend of mine at the university who lived in a house, and I went to see him one night, and he said that the guy who owned the house had been there the night before, and he had bought the house next door and was going to build a 15-unit apartment building. And my immediate reaction was, well, why don't we go pitch them? We're students, these are for student apartments, we ought to know what they want, and we'll manage it, and we'll each get a free apartment. And so we went and made up a little brochure, and we pitched them, and they bought our act. So we, early in my junior year, we started working on this project, which was finished by the time I graduated as a senior. And we rented it, we just helped design it, we bought the furniture, and it worked. And so then they gave us another building, and then somebody else gave us a building, and then we started buying buildings, and so by the time I graduated from law school, I think we managed a couple thousand apartments, and we owned about 20 buildings, and had a good time. The real motivation for this business was I knew that the only way that I could get through law school was if I had something that really distracted me and eliminated the boredom of going to school. Oh, I think anybody who doesn't acknowledge the fact that there are various points of great concern or concern about risk. Obviously I've had many of them over 50 years, and they're all kind of different, but in the end, I mean, I do quite a bit of speaking about entrepreneurship, and the real measure of an entrepreneur starts with some kind of a level of self-confidence. I tell people that everybody can see problems. Entrepreneurs see problems, but also see solutions. And right or wrong, I've always had a lot of confidence in my judgments. and most of the time, it's worked out. I think that when I look at the world today, and by the way, the world is the whole world, not just the U.S. or Canada. I think the single biggest issue worldwide is lack of demand. Where's the demand going to come from? Where is growth going to come from? To basically, recapture the status of the world previous to the financial crisis. So the question was, how was the world going to evolve? And obviously currencies were the answer. But when we have the kind of instability in the currency world that we have today, I think the environment is dangerous. I think the environment is likely to perpetuate slow growth. And slow growth is not a formula that is likely to produce very positive results in the future. We need to be very careful. I think that all this QE2 stuff and what they're doing at the ACB, this, et cetera, I think we're creating potential bubbles and potential issues and problems that I think need to be addressed. I think that the naivete is that we've done it and got away with it without any, at least near-term implications. But anybody who makes decisions based on short-term decisions suffers from it accordingly. And I think that, worldwide, we have to get everything back on track, or we're going to just slow down further. And I think that is going to create all kinds of problems worldwide. First and foremost, you don't go anywhere without a partner, a local partner, because anybody who's naive enough to think that they could go into a court in Brazil as a U.S. guy and say, well, this guy screwed me, no chance. I've been hometowned too many different times. And by the way, you don't have to be an emerging market to get hometown. Try investing in France. If you're not a French, the rules are very different. So everywhere we went, first and foremost was, who's our partner? And can that partner both protect us from the local environment, help us interpret the local environment, and have enough skin in the game so that we both have aligned positions. Philanthropy has always been a stellar element of our whole family. I mean, it's always been, part of the process and part of what we think about. Initially, I didn't have much of a problem with philanthropy because I didn't have any money. Things have changed. I like to tell people that when I was a student at the university, they didn't really care much about me, and certainly didn't pay much attention. But recently, they've seemed to have taken a much greater interest in me than they did when I was a student. But I guess I've learned a lot of things. I mean, initially I kind of spread things around and realized that I could never make a difference unless I was willing to concentrate. I also believed very strongly that anybody can put their name on a building, and that was not appealing to me. What I wanted to do was create methodologies to make a difference, to change things. And one of the areas that I'm really obsessed about is entrepreneurship. My orientation is not only to provide funding, but also to be involved. I think my orientation has been to limit the number of different animosity efforts, but to focus them so that you could really see the change, see the difference. And that's, when it's all said and done, we're all, mortal, and you got to look over your shoulder and say, what have I accomplished? And I consider this animosity efforts in lots of different areas very much part of who I should be and who I want to be.
Can you share with us what you've learned from your mistakes?
It's really simple. You go back to the 20s, and there was a very famous financier named Bernard Baruch, and he said, his famous quote was, "Nobody ever went broke taking a profit." I think the most important thing that I'm focused on is I'm not too worried about how good it's going to get. my entire focus is always on the downside. And if I were to identify mistakes, they all come down to underestimating or under risking the downside. And when it's all said and done, there's nothing better than knowing where you are as quickly as possible.
I think I started by assuming that conventional wisdom was irrelevant. I just never bought into conventional wisdom, and I never, I look at the Forbes 400 and I see all these guys and take all the people who inherited the money off the list, and everybody else went left when conventional wisdom went right. There's been a lot of times in my life when it's been lonely being, an entrepreneur with a viewpoint that nobody else shared. And there were a lot of times when I looked over my shoulder and said, gee, why aren't there a whole bunch of people waiting in line to do the same thing that I'm doing? Yeah. Recognizing the fact that if everybody was doing it, there wouldn't be an opportunity.
I think that I was driven by the desire to feel fulfilled. When I was a kid, I had a very close friend, and he and I were laying on the living room floor one day. Maybe we were 17, and he looked at me and he said, what makes you the way you are? So I obviously was probably driven at that point too. And I looked at him and I said, I think that, every one of us is born with certain traits and skills and abilities. And I've always felt that my obligation is to maximize those talents that I've been given, whatever they may be. And that's driven me more than anything else, is that, that's an obligation to society.
But have you worked with people, even in your work life, that have made you better?
Well, I think that it depends. The answer, of course, is yes. But I think the answer is adjusted accordingly. As you mentioned, my work life per se has been quite different than most people who had jobs. Opposed to your experience, I never got to work with the kinds of people that you had those kinds of enormous influences on you. People really stood in line to invest with me. So, but those people were fabulous people. I mean, they were the excellence generation, of their generations, as reflected by economically how they did, and the breadth of what they did was enormous. And so it for sure kindled all my curiosity and encouraged me. Somebody once asked me, how would I best describe, who I am and what I do? And the answer is that I consider myself a professional opportunist. And so when we took over that first 15-unit building, and we worked hard at it, and we learned a lot. When the second building was offered to us, it was just a natural, and it wasn't even a difficult choice. And then when the third building was offered to us, Lurie was the guy we hired to run the third building. And eventually we, ran a whole bunch of other buildings, and then started buying buildings, and it just all became, well.
For those that aren't born with it, can you learn how to become an entrepreneur?
Maybe you got to start by defining what it is an entrepreneur. It's because it's a big psychological scenario. It's a high level of self-confidence. It's an ability to absorb rejection. It's an ability to shut off the noise and recognize that conventional wisdom is not necessarily the answer to the problem. You take all those things and you end up with different kinds of entrepreneurs. We were aware of the fact that the print ad business was starting to become subject to the internet competition. Anyway, we took over January 1st, give or take, 2008. And in the first 30 days, print revenue dropped 30%. I would tell you that, and that stayed that way all year. When you talk about an industry like media, a revenue drop of 30% is not salvageable. And so consequently, we ended up losing the property and losing the deal. And I learned, like you do from everything you do, you learn from it. What I learned from it was that I really thought that the decision to buy it, assuming that my projections of what was going to happen were reasonably right, I still think was a good decision at the time. And I looked at it as a real estate deal. And we got the real estate, we got all these different newspapers. We had valuations on the sale of each part of the Tribune that we were getting. We created a very tax attractive methodology for ownership. But probably the most important thing we did is we lost $350 million. We, in effect, established that as the risk amount we were willing to risk to do the deal, so that we lost, but were able to talk about it afterwards and continue. I think I learned that, being able to understand not only what the risk is, but limit the risk to a level you could handle and allow yourself to, in effect, pursue opportunity thereafter. I'm a great believer in culture. That's part of the reason I think this work from home concept is like pet rocks. I think we need to be together. I think that it's very important. My definition of culture is the enemy is without. Abe Lincoln might have succeeded with a team of rivals. I don't think I want a team of rivals. I want a team of people who work together and take on outside challenges. You look for opportunities, you look for ways to make a difference, and execute accordingly. And I think that if you do that, then by definition, you've improved the lives of others. You've created opportunity for others, and you've left a mark on society. We've done a lot of charitable work. We've done a lot of work in education. We've done a lot of work in the medical health, medical arena. And most of the time, I'd say, very little of it is, quote, a check to the American Cancer Society. That doesn't cut it. What cuts it is when you do something that you're involved in. So when I do something like the University of Michigan Entrepreneurial Center, I go to all the meetings. I participate in the same manner in other things that we do. Helen's created a writing program at the University of Michigan and goes up there and spends a day and talks to the kids, and I think that's marvelous. But they need, they need idols, and they need people they can look up to, and that's part of the process.
I grew up in an environment where I didn't know that anything wasn't possible, and so and over the years, people would come and they, come and have lunch with me or whatever, and they'd say, geez, how did you do that? And I basically answered that I didn't know I couldn't. And if you don't know you can't, then there are no limitations. So we've adapted to a lot of challenges, but it's all about the fact that anything and everything is possible in this environment. I think that maybe the best answer to that question is there is no better opportunity than to lead by example. And I have been the leader of, this is give or take 50 years since I started doing this, since I graduated from law school. And more than anything else, I've set the example. And I've set the example by, taking on new challenges, climbing new mountains, maybe starting with a rope, pulling somebody up behind me. But then, they found they could do it, and my job is to be the cheerleader. And today, at this point in my career, I spend my whole day sitting there and getting pitched by my people, and with ideas and challenges. And my job is to, refine their ideas and reorient them and challenge them to take it the next step. I'm not afraid to defend my position. Neither should you. And so you got to take me on if you think I'm wrong. And nobody is quicker to acknowledge that they're wrong than I am. Because ultimately the environment that I create is a one of access, is a one of not negotiation, but interface among people. I mean, we have a very unusual environment in that we've only had one person recruited at a senior level away in 50 years. Start with an enormous respect for the risk of execution. I can't tell you how many times, it's like I have a watch here. If my watch has one moving part, then it has a very small probability of not working. Right. If my watch had 50 moving parts, then there would be another 49 potential reasons why it didn't work. In the same manner, when somebody comes to me and they say, wow, we have this great opportunity, we're going to do this and we'll sell this and then we'll buy this. And I look at them and I just look at them and I say, that represents, enormous risk. That what happens if you get into the third step and it doesn't work? Where do you go from there? So I think what it is you're attempting to do is critically important. I thought that it was all about, willingness to, quote, open every door, answer every phone call, chase every opportunity, because I don't really believe in, I set out to do this and that's why I was successful. I think 90% of success is accidental. Accidental in terms of the opportunity arising, not accidental in terms of people's understanding and willingness to take it up. And I know that, I have basically been business agnostic. I probably have been a significant player in 20 different industries. I could have been 40. The standard has always been I don't take on a business that I couldn't run myself if I had to.
Well, I've been an entrepreneur, since I was 10 years old, and I've always been intrigued by coming up with ideas, and when I went to the University of Michigan, I was never a great academic. It didn't really catch my attention, and so I ended up getting involved in big campus activities, and one of them, I had a friend who was the general chairman, and I went over to see him one night, and he said he lived in a house, and he said the guy who owned the house had been over the night before, and he had bought the house next door and was gonna, as soon as school was over, was gonna knock both houses down and build a 15-unit apartment building. And my first reaction to my friend was, geez, why don't we go pitch him? Maybe we could manage the apartment building and we each could get a free apartment. And after all, we're students, and we know what what the students want. And so we put together a little brochure and we went and made our pitch. And much to our shock, they bought it. And so we took over, renting them while the building was under construction. We rented all the apartments. We just, worked out and bought all the furniture and eventually rented all the apartments. And that's how it started. Grew up in a pretty unusual household. My parents were extraordinarily appreciative of the fact that they were able to come to America. They were very appreciative of what it meant to be in a society where, merit was what really counted, and that there was, unlimited opportunity. And they imbued in me the idea that anything was possible in America and that I could do anything. And I think that, that really played a role in all of the things that I've done. Many of them could best be described as not knowing that I wasn't supposed to be able to do them. There were just so many things that I did along my career that was just, from my perspective, logical. And other people responded by saying, nobody's ever done that before. It was relatively easy for me to, go off on my own and recognize that what I needed to do was not get caught up in the noise, and that it wasn't really about being compared to others, but it was about absolute achievement. And that's what drove me. And I think, that kind of background that I came from was certainly very much contributory to my ability to do that.
What can some young entrepreneurs take away from the story in terms of being able to decide which career path they'll pursue?
I'm a great believer in understanding and observing what's going on. I think it's pretty interesting that I ended up in real estate, but I might have ended up doing something else. But what I was very opportunistic, had a lot of confidence in myself, had a lot of belief that kind of understanding what was going on around me was critical. When I talk about entrepreneurs, I talk about the fact that they're very good at seeing problems. But what the successful entrepreneur is not only ones who see problems, but see solutions. And for whatever reason, I had that kind of capability. And I also had learned to deal with rejection. Now, an entrepreneur doesn't believe that he ever fails. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And sometimes you get up off your rear end and climb the mountain again. But there are no failures. And in the same manner, I think that, my career has very much been affected by the fact that I was just driven to keep trying to solve the problems and identify the solutions and then, live with the execution, so that you can, if you're good at doing that, then you can quantify what the risk is and, how much risk you're taking. And then the question of how much risk you're taking has to connect to, what I'll call staying power. The number of people who in my career, have fallen by the wayside because they took on too much risk or they took on the risk that required substance they didn't have to keep it alive. Combination of understanding the downside, and then once you've understood the downside, as far as I'm concerned, I had one transaction which was frankly the best transaction from an investment point of view I ever had, even though we lost money, was because we exactly predicted what the risk was. And before we did it, we had the resources and the staying power to absorb that risk. I don't know about the mistakes, but the concept is very simple. And again, it's the same theme about conventional wisdom. I came up with that concept in the late 70s when people were buying real estate, and I just didn't understand it. I'm a voluminous reader. I read 5 newspapers a day. I read 3 magazines a week. I'm constantly reading and educating myself and exposing myself to more and more information. And the more that that's the case, the more likely I'm to make informed decisions. Well, I think the themes have been, pretty prevalent in this conversation tonight. Simplicity, respect for execution, staying power, understanding the downside. These are all, elements that come into assessing the risk and implementing it accordingly. Obviously, I ask him all kinds of stuff, but the one thing that I ask him is, are you hungry? Because in the end, there's some kind of a minimum intellectual quotient necessary to achieve, but you don't need 190 IQ or anything like that. What you need is motivation. And when I'm interviewing somebody, the single most important thing I'm trying to understand is, how motivated are they? And if they're appropriately motivated, then I can create the opportunity for them to extend it and achieve success.